Hi everyone, this is Karen Whooley, and I'm going to show you a little bit about gauge when it comes to the modern Metro pattern. I've done here a little gauge swatch. I'm using Cascade 220 for the swatch, so it's a different yarn than what I used for the original. And I did use the exact same hook. I believe it's a J. It's a 5.5 millimeter, I believe is what I used. Oh, a 6.0, sorry. I used a 6.0 for this. And I did a gauge swatch of 20 stitches. Normally I would tell you, whenever you do a gauge swatch, you should do a 6-inch wide swatch by 6 inches tall. That way when you measure your gauge, you will always have a good fabric there to measure 4 inches. You never want to measure the edges or the tops and bottoms in your gauge because that can distort your gauge. And it's especially true in this particular stitch pattern because the stitches on the edge, especially, not so much the top and bottom, but the two edges, it's a different stitch. You're not working into the back bump like you did for the stitches across the row. So that's going to distort your gauge a little bit. This one is actually 5 inches wide. And before I actually get into gauge, I want to recommend, I always use a regular tape measure for calculating gauge. I have a few other little tools like the gauge swatch measuring things that you used to get from Susan Bates, the metal ones that have the L in it to measure row and stitches. And I also have one that's a plastic one from Ackerworks. I don't know if you've seen it. It looks like an X or a cross, and it's got 4 inches up and down and 4 inches across. That works really, really well for knitting, but not so great for crochet. So for me, the tried and true is always going to be just a regular tape measure, especially with crochet. So I want to talk to you about how to actually measure your stitches. These are a little different, but actually the chains that work across the fabric make it really easy to measure your stitch gauge. So you always want to measure 4 inches. Because if you measure less than that, you might have a half a stitch here and a quarter stitch there and at each inch, and that is going to distort again. If you just measured 1 inch, you might get 3 here, but you might get 4 over here, you know, that kind of thing. So you always want to go across 4 inches. And I've made a little sheet here that I'll show you in a second. You can copy this and do it for your own gauge, for your own modern Metro. So I'm going to measure 4 inches, and I'm always going to measure somewhere in the middle of the fabric. I don't want to get the edges. And this one's about a 5 inch, so I want to bring it in to about a ½ inch from the edge. And here, what makes this really easy to do your stitch gauge is that you have these chains, and each one, you know, each one of those chains is a stitch. So if I put my 0 right at the edge of this stitch and then leave my 4 wherever it lands and count between the 0 and the 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and I'm going to say 15 and a half. So on my chart here that I did, I said how many stitches are in 4 inches? I'm going to do 15 and a half. 15.5. Okay? And then I'm going to do the same thing with the rows on this. Now remember I told you in the previous video that when I count rows, I always use the wrong side because I've always got this extra 2 inches at the bottom. Or not 2 inches, 2 rows at the bottom. And I do that also when I'm measuring gauge with this particular stitch because I know this is 2 rows and I can skip over those and go to the next one. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put the 0 right at the edge of the stitch of the chains here. And I'm going to pull this 4 over and I'm going to count 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. This would be 16. It's just short. So I'm going to just go ahead and use 16 stitches because it's really close. So we're going to say 16 rows per 4 inches. Okay, so if you look at the gauge on the original pattern, I'm going to bring this up here a little bit. the gauge says 16 KSS or knitted single stitch and 13 KSS knitted single stitch rows equal 4 inches. So this number originally, I'm going to grab another pen. This one should have been 14 and this one should have been 15 based on the gauge in the pattern. Now, my gauge is different. So obviously, if I were to want it to be exactly what the pattern tells me, I'm actually have more stitches here than the 14. So I would go down 1 hook size. That's only a stitch and a half. So I don't go down 1 hook size to try to get that 14 stitches per inch. And again, here I have 1 more stitch than the 15. So I'd go down 1 hook size for that as well. If I was more than like 2 or 3 stitches, I would say if I was more than 3 stitches off, lower or more, if I had, let's say I had 17 stitches here, I would go down 2 hook sizes. I'm sorry, go up 2 hook sizes. Same thing here. If I had 3 extra stitches, so if I was at 18 there, I would go up another 2 hook sizes. So you kind of want to play with it to try to get the exact gauge. Now, if you can't get the exact gauge and you like the drape that your swatch has, now this one's a little stiff for me. I would probably go up another hook size to do this because the drape is just a little too stiff for me. But if you like your drape, or you're using a finer yarn, like a fingering weight, or even a DK weight, or you've gone to a chunky yarn, you're going to want to follow along with the next few steps that I'm going to give you. Now, if you're changing the weight of the yarn, all bets are off of what the actual pattern says. You're going to just work with the yarn and a hook until you find the hook size that gives you the drape that you want the fabric to have. Now remember, when you block your swatch, it's going to have different drape than when you just finish crocheting it. So I bet you if I wet block this, put it in water and let it dry, it would be a little less stiff. So I might not change my hook size. But I recommend if you're going to make a swatch for your project, well, you're going to have to, because if you want the project to fit you properly, you're going to need to do your gauge swatch. And I would just kind of pin it out and steam it. If you have an iron, put it on the high setting with steam and just run the iron above the fabric. Don't touch the fabric, just above it till it gets wet, and then just kind of flatten it out and straighten it out and let it dry for a little bit and then measure your gauge. Or you can do a full wet block, but if you do just the steam, you don't have to cut the yarn like I did. You can leave it attached, just put like a stitch marker in the loop so you don't unravel, and steam it, pin it out, let it dry a little bit, and then do your gauge. And then you can rip it all back out and use the yarn that you used for your gauge swatch in your pattern. A lot of times if I have multiple skeins, what I'll do is I'll do the gauge swatch with one skein, I'll leave it attached, I'll steam it out, I'll leave it attached to the original skein, I'll start the project with a different skein of yarn, and then if I need this yarn, I'll go back and pull it out, and I might even steam it a little bit to straighten out all the kinks before I start using it. But you don't necessarily have to detach it from the skein until you're ready to use it. Okay, so let's say I love this gauge, and when you check your gauge, you plug your numbers in exactly the way I did. You want to figure out how to start your starting chain so that you have the right measurements. If you look at the schematic, it says it's 20 by either 69 or 81. That depends on which size you're doing. All sizes will be 20 inches this way. It's the length of your big triangle or your big rectangle that is going to change based on which size you're using. Now, when you do your starting chain for your back side, this is the back side of the pattern. It tells you you're going to chain in the pattern, the back panel, chain 71 and 71 for both sizes. I've been asked that question. Why are they both 71? Same with the front panel. Why are they both 36? It's because both patterns use exactly the same starting chain, because we're working from the narrow end and we're working the length of the fabric. We're not chaining this and going up. We're chaining this and going across. So that's why both patterns are exactly the same size. So this one is 20 and the front panel is, according to the schematic, 10. So I'm going to use the small size, and I'm going to use the back panel as my example, but you're going to do exactly the same thing for the front panel. So first thing you're going to do is, once you've got your stitches and rows for 4 inches, you're going to figure out what that number is for each inch in those 4 inches. This is where I said why you have to measure the 4 inches, and then you'll get a more accurate number for your stitches per inch. So in the case of the rows, or I'm sorry, in the stitches, I'm going to do 15.5 divided by 4, because we have 4 inches, and that's going to equal 3.875. Okay, so this is 15.5, and that equals, see how there is a weird decimal there? Sometimes I'll round it to 2 figures instead of 3, so this might be a 3.88, and I always round up a little to give us a little wiggle room. In this case, when it's a ½ inch or a half of a, I guess this is a half of a hundredth, that's what I would do here. But if in this case, I'm going to go ahead and leave it at the 3 digits. So then we're going to also do the same thing for rows. So we had 16 stitches. I don't have to use the calculator for that. 16 divided by 4 is 4. So we have 4 rows per inch. Okay, so whatever your gauge is here, you're going to use this exact same math that you see right here. This box is where we're going to get your sweet spot for your starting chain. Okay, so now for your starting chain for your back panel, we have to have the starting chain 20 inches. So we're going to take 20 inches and multiply it by the 3.875, okay? So we're going to do that. 20 times 3.875, and that equals 77.5. I would round that up to 78, okay? Just because that gives us a little wiggle room. 77.5, or I'm going to put in here 78, okay? And then because we're using single crochet, we have to add a chain at the end. So it's going to be, actually your starting chain is going to be 79 chains. So to get your 20 inches based on the gauge that you got on your gauge swatch, you are going to need to chain 79, or I am going to need to chain 79. Now for the length, we're going to do the exact same idea, except we're going to use the rows per inch. So we're going to do 69, I'm using the small size, times 4. If you were going to do the larger size, this would be 81. So you're going to do it times 4. So I'm going to do 69 times 4 equals 276 rows. So you know that when you hit 276 rows, you should be at 69 inches. Now, as you work with crochet, I'm sure a lot of you have come across this. You are working, let's say one night you're working and you're watching TV, another night you're sitting and talking with your husband or your friend, or the next time you work on it, you're at your guild meeting, you know, something like that. So your gauge can change with your moods and their location of what where you are and what you're doing. I have had baby Afghans that I've worked on that I'll be really calm, and then I'll be watching a football game and boom, I get stressed out because my team is losing, and all of a sudden everything cinches up and gets really tight. So you want to make sure that every few inches, I would say every 4 to 5 inches, you check your gauge. And this number here, as far as rows, might change if you're off by like a 1/4 inch or something. Make sure that your spaces between your chains don't change all that much. Otherwise, it's going to look really sloppy. But you do want to check your gauge as you're going along, especially when you're making that 69 or 81 inch long piece. That will change. You also want to make sure, now see, this hasn't been blocked, but you can kind of see this naturally has like an hourglass here. I don't know, I'm going to put it up a little closer. Especially on this side, it gets a little bit of an hourglass more than this side. That is very common with this stitch. That just means that I have tightened up the sides a little too much when I did the last stitch on each row. You want to make sure you keep those loose and in the same tension as the stitches you're going across the row. But also, this is something, it's so very slight that blocking would fix that. But if you're finding that you're going really far in like that, or it's like you're wide at the bottom and it starts to triangle, you might want to adjust your gauge, rip back and adjust your gauge. When you hold a piece of fabric up like this and hang it, it's naturally, especially as it gets longer, it's naturally going to get wider at the bottom and narrower at the top, especially when it's really long piece, because the weight is just going to make the bottom spread out, and the weight is pulling on the top, and that's going to narrow everything. So when you're measuring your back panel and even your front panel, it's going to be pretty heavy. You're going to always want to put it out on the table to measure. That will give you a better idea of whether or not your gauge is right. Also, if you're off, your gauge swatch says, okay, I'm going to chain 79 and that's going to be 20 inches. And as you start working, you have what I call the shrinkage factor as you're working, and you're off, instead of being 20 inches, it might be 19 and a half. Blocking will fix that, that much. If you are supposed to be at 20 and you're down to like 17 and a half, 18, even 19 inches instead of 20, you have tightened up from what you've done with your gauge swatch, and you're going to want to rip it out and start all over again. So even blocking won't hold an inch of stretch unless you're doing lace work, and this is definitely not lace work. This is a really dense fabric. So that is what gauge is all about with this particular pattern on Modern Metro. I'm gonna let you look at this for a little bit so that you can even pause the camera and make a copy of this for yourself, so that you know what the chart is that I use when I'm working on something like this. So if you have any questions, again, ask me in the Facebook group or give me a jingle on my website, go to my contact page, or just let me know that you want to talk privately too. And we can set something up as well on that. But this should give you a really good idea of how to figure out your gauge. This should help you with changing the weight of your yarn. If you're having trouble deciding how drapey you want something, let me know, and I can even set up a Skype call with you. We can look at your swatches on Skype and talk about it. So anyway, that's it, and I'll talk to you soon.